But it's an interesting story when you look into it. Number one, the vote was not close. It was 14-1. The only dissenting vote, and it's a qualified dissent, which I'll get to, the only dissenting vote was the American judge, Thomas Bergenthal. Number two, if you read World Court decisions, and I've had occasion to read quite a few in recent months, you can't help but be struck at how uncontroversial this decision is as compared to others. There are people in this room, for example, who will remember the 1996 World Court decision on the legality of use of nuclear weapons, whether under international law a country is allowed to use nuclear weapons. That decision was very close. It was 7-7, and then the tie-breaking vote was by the president of the World Court. Or another decision, Cyrus will surely remember it, the decision in 1984 by the World Court on the legality of the war the U.S. was waging against Nicaragua. Well, it's quite interesting there. If you read all the opinions, the majority opinion, the separate opinions, the dissenting opinion by Judge Schwebel, it comes to about 1,000 pages. You see real controversy. But when you come to this court decision by the World Court on the wall, altogether, the majority opinion, the separate opinions, the dissenting opinion by Bergenthal, altogether it comes to under 100 pages. It simply was not controversial. These are not complicated questions. It's not true at all that this was a rubber stamp court. In fact, one of the judges leaned over quite hard on the Israeli side, Rosalind Higgins, the judge from Britain, very smart woman. She happens to be Jewish, though married an Irishman. But on the basic questions, there was no dispute. There was no controversy whatsoever. The only dissenting opinion, as I mentioned, was Thomas Bergenthal. And Bergenthal, in World Court procedure protocol, you have a majority opinion, then separate opinions, dissenting opinions, and then there's a middle category called a declaration, which means you're right in between dissenting and supporting the majority opinion. Bergenthal, the one negative vote, he does not issue a dissenting opinion, he issues a declaration. And he begins the declaration by saying, there is much in the majority opinion with which I agree. And Bergenthal then says, and Carter points it out in his book, Bergenthal says, I agree. Under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, those settlements are illegal. And he says, if the wall being built is to protect the settlements, he says it's, and I'm quoting him, ipso facto illegal, which means on the main question, all 15 judges agree. And that then raises, I think, an interesting question. Namely, we're told that these are the most controversial questions. Borders, settlements, Jerusalem, and I'll get to later, refugees. And yet, when you look at the actual documentary record, you look at the actual legal record, there's no controversy at all. Everybody agrees, and it was not like a close call, a heated debate. There was no debate at all. Go look at the opinion, the separate opinions. I keep rereading them because it sometimes surprises me. Nobody disagrees it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Nobody disagrees Israel has no title to a single square inch of the territories it occupied in June '67. Nobody disagrees the settlements are all illegal, the ones in the West Bank and the ones surrounding East Jerusalem. nobody disagrees that East Jerusalem, all of East Jerusalem, is occupied Palestinian territory. And so that then leads to the subject of this evening's talk. Why does so much controversy swirl around Carter's book, and more broadly the Israel-Palestine conflict, when there's so little disagreement when you look at the record? What I want to do now briefly is look at three aspects of that record: the history, the current situation, and how to resolve the conflict. It used to be said, and when I was growing up it was true, that there was quite a lot of controversy surrounding the history of the conflict. And for those of you who go back as far as I do, or further on the topic, you will no doubt recall that the most controversial question always was, how did those Palestinians become refugees in 1948? The dominant view, the one that was expressed by Israel and most American academics, was some version of, in 1948, the Arab army stood poised on the borders of Palestine, ready to invade, and they transmitted messages to the Palestinian population that they should leave their homes, clear their fields for the invading Arab armies, and that the Palestinians would be able to return when the Jews had been swept into the sea. That point of view, that as a dominant point of view, there were some dissenters on the margins and the fringes. That dominant point of view probably prevailed until roughly the mid to late 1980s. Come the late 1980s, some Israeli scholars, mostly Israeli scholars, begin looking through Israeli archives, and they reach the conclusion that it's just not true. There's no evidence for these Arab radio broadcasts. That claim had simply been fabricated. And they reached the conclusion, to quote the main historian on the topic, Benny Morris, that the Palestinians suffered what Benny Morris calls a partial ethnic cleansing in 1948. Partial because not all the Palestinians were expelled. Now, I'm not going to deny that there is debate still on the topic, but the debate is now within very narrow parameters. The debate nowadays is, among serious scholars, the debate nowadays is, were the Palestinians, did they become refugees through the happenstance of war? That is to say, everyone here knows wars generate refugees, and that were they the unfortunate victims of war, or was it premeditated? Benny Morris famously says it was unintentional, it was the happenstance of war. In his often quoted phrase, the Palestinian refugee question was born of war, not by design. And other scholars say not so, that it was premeditated. What's interesting here is how narrow the debate has become. One example. Last year, Israel's former foreign minister, and a very smart guy, he's a trained historian, he's serious, Shlomo Ben-Ami, he was one of Israel's chief negotiators at Camp David in 2000. Shlomo Ben-Ami puts out a book entitled Scars of War, Wounds of Peace. And the first 100 or so pages, background to the negotiations, he discusses the history of the conflict. And Ben-Ami says, yes, it's true, it was an ethnic cleansing in 1948. That's pretty clear from the record. But he says, I don't really agree with Benny Morris. I don't think it was an accident of war. He says, I think it was premeditated. It was anchored in what he calls the Zionist philosophy of transfer. And there you have an interesting example of where the real debate among real scholars is. There's no talk anymore of this Arab radio broadcasts and that nonsense. The former Israeli foreign minister now takes the most extreme position within the narrow spectrum. He says it was a premeditated expulsion in 1948. Let's now turn to the current situation, the human rights question. And here we have another interesting example. Israel's probably the most monitored place on earth by human rights organizations. The big organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the local organizations, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and then there's a whole slew of others. No point in listing all of them, but there's a large number.